The Galactic Council believed we were bluffing until we shattered their order. Part 2. The Trial of the Infant Species. The grand atrium of the Galactic Council was the largest enclosed space Nathan Cole had ever seen. The ceiling rose so high above them that it disappeared into a layer of artificial clouds, soft and white, lit from within by hidden lights that mimicked sunlight. Holographic banners hung from the upper walls, each one representing a member species. There were hundreds of them, shimmering gently in colors that human eyes could barely process. Nathan found humanity's banner near the bottom of the far wall. It was small, roughly the size of a bedsheet, and it had been placed behind the faded emblem of a species that had gone extinct 2 centuries ago. The positioning was not an accident. She said nothing, but her jaw tightened. Ambassador Daniel Haynes walked ahead of them with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight, and his face carefully blank. He wore a dark formal suit, simple and clean, the kind of outfit that said nothing and everything at the same time. Flanking the group was a small security detail, led by Sergeant Pete Novak, a broad-shouldered Marine with a shaved head and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. Pete rarely spoke. When he did, people listened. They were escorted to a section of seating near the floor of the chamber, far below the elevated platforms where the senior species sat. The arrangement was designed to make anyone standing at the lower level feel small. It worked on most species. Nathan had dealt with worse. The session was called to order by High Arbiter Zelkan, a Dralith of considerable height and presence. The Dralith were a reptilian species, covered in dark scales that shifted color slightly depending on their mood. Zelkan's scales were a steady, cold gray. He looked down at the human delegation the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive table. Beside Zelkan sat the Solhari representative, a thin being with luminous skin that pulsed with faint light, and the Karath representative, a squat creature wrapped in heavy robes whose face was hidden behind a mask of polished metal. Together, these 3 species formed the core of the Council's power. They had held that power for thousands of years, and they did not intend to share it. Zelkan spoke first. His voice was deep and carried easily through the vast chamber without any need for amplification. He read the charges against humanity in a tone that suggested the outcome had already been decided. Humanity had expanded into the Valen Reach without authorization. The Reach was a protected zone established by ancient treaty. The presence of human colonies there was a violation of galactic law. The Council demanded immediate withdrawal and the payment of reparations to both the Dralith and the Solhari. When he finished, he looked down at the Terran delegation and waited. Haynes stood. He straightened his jacket, walked to the speaking platform at the center of the floor, and looked up at the assembled council. Over 100 delegations stared back at him. Most of them had never heard a human speak in this chamber before. He began calmly. His voice was steady and measured, and he spoke the way a teacher might speak to a room full of students, not with arrogance, but with the quiet authority of someone who had done his research. He told the council that he respected their traditions. He told them that humanity understood the importance of the Valen Reach and the history behind its designation as a buffer zone. Then he told them that they were wrong. The original treaty restricting access to the Valen Reach had been signed 3,000 years ago between the Dralith and the Solhari. Under Council Charter Law, all territorial treaties required renewal every 500 years. The Valen Treaty had last been renewed 2,600 years ago. It had expired 600 years before humanity even reached the stars. No one had bothered to renew it because no one had needed to. The Reach had simply been left alone. Furthermore, Haynes said, humanity had followed every required procedure for expansion. They had filed the proper notices. They had submitted colony plans through the correct channels. They had waited the mandatory response period. No response came. Under Council law, Silence after the response period was interpreted as approval. He laid out the legal arguments with the precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. He cited specific articles of the Council Charter. He referenced case law from disputes between other species that had been resolved in favor of the expanding party under similar circumstances. The chamber was quiet when he finished. Several delegations from the minor species shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. The legal argument was solid, and anyone paying attention could see it. Zelkon was paying attention. He sat still for a long moment, his gray scales not moving at all. Then he spoke. "The Council acknowledges the representative's familiarity with our charter," he said, and his tone made familiarity sound like a disease. "However, the intent of the Violent Treaty is clear, regardless of its technical status. The Drelith and the Solhari have maintained the Reach as neutral space for 3 millennia. This understanding supersedes procedural details. Humanity will withdraw within 30 standard days, or face full sanctions, including the revocation of provisional membership and a complete economic blockade." He did not ask for a vote. He did not invite discussion. He simply declared it and moved on to the next item. Haynes returned to his seat. His face was calm, but Nathan noticed the slight tremor in his right hand as he sat down. The ambassador folded his hands together to hide it. They returned to their quarters aboard the orbital station that evening. The rooms were clean and functional, but sparse, clearly designed for species the Council considered unimportant. Pete Novak checked every room for surveillance devices, and found 3. He disabled them without comment. The delegation gathered in the central room. Haynes paced near the window, looking out at the glittering sprawl of Ashara Prime below them. Nathan sat at the table. Laura stood by the door with her arms crossed. "I can file an appeal," Haynes said. "The charter allows for it. We present the case to a review panel, and they have to examine the evidence." "The review panel is appointed by Zelkon," Laura said. "He picks who sits on it. There are rules about impartiality. There are rules about a lot of things. They just showed us how much they care about rules." Haynes stopped pacing. He looked at Nathan, who had not spoken since they left the chamber. "What do you think?" Haynes asked. Nathan leaned forward and rested his arms on the table. "I think you did exactly what you needed to do in there. You showed everyone that we have a legal case. That matters, not because it will change Zelkon's mind, but because it puts doubt in the minds of every other species that watched." "Doubt is not enough," Haynes said. "Not by itself, no." Laura pulled up her datapad and projected a holographic display over the table. It showed the Valen Reach, marked with red dots, indicating Drelith warship positions. The number had grown since their last check. She walked them through her analysis. "There are now over 40 Drelith capital ships in the Reach," she said. "That is more firepower than they deployed during their last actual war. This is not about keeping a buffer zone. The Reach contains massive deposits of a mineral called Valite. It is essential for building advanced slipspace drives. The Drelith want it, but they cannot claim it openly, because the Solhari would object. So, they keep everyone else out and mine it in secret." The room was silent. "If we leave," Nathan said, "the Drelith take the Valite. They build faster ships. They extend their reach. In 50 years, they are the dominant power in the galaxy, and every other species, including us, lives at their pleasure." Haynes sat down heavily. "So this was never about our colonies." "No, our colonies just forced the issue." Nathan pulled out his communicator and opened a secure channel. He connected to Admiral Karen Blake at Terran Fleet Command on Earth. The connection took almost a minute to establish through the encrypted relay network, and when Blake's voice came through, it was steady and serious. He told her everything: the farce of the hearing, the Drelith fleet, the Valite, the 30-day deadline. Blake listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause. I am sending you something. It will arrive in 6 days. Do not let them move the timeline forward. Stall however you need to. Understood, Nathan said. The channel closed. Haynes looked at him from across the room. What is she sending? The thing we need. Haynes stood and walked back to the window. The city below stretched to the horizon, a web of lights and movement, alien and vast and indifferent to the small group of humans looking down at it. They think we are afraid, he said quietly. Nathan rose from his chair and joined him at the window. Good, he said. Let them. The Galactic Council believed we were bluffing, until we shattered their order. Part 3. The Weight of Silence. The 6 days that followed were the longest of Daniel Haynes' life, and he had once spent 3 weeks negotiating a water rights treaty between 2 Earth nations that genuinely hated each other. But that had been among humans, and humans, for all their faults, at least argued in a language he could understand. The Galactic Council operated on different rules. The powerful did not argue, they simply declared, and the rest obeyed. Haynes decided that if they wanted to use procedure as a weapon, he would bury them in it. On the first day, he filed a formal appeal against the ruling, citing 14 separate articles of the Council Charter. On the second day, he submitted a request for access to the original Valen Treaty archives, which under Council law had to be granted within 2 business cycles. On the third day, he filed a motion demanding that the Council disclose the current military deployments in the Valen Reach, arguing that any species with warships in a supposedly neutral zone should be required to explain their presence. On the fourth day, he requested a full historical review of every territorial dispute resolved by the Council in the last 1,000 years, claiming that he needed the precedents for his appeal. Each filing required a response. Each response generated more questions. Each question required another filing. The Council's legal office, staffed primarily by Karath bureaucrats who prided themselves on thoroughness, found itself drowning in Terran paperwork. It was, as Laura Price put it, the most polite attack anyone had ever launched against the galactic government. Behind the scenes, Nathan Cole was doing something quieter and far more dangerous. On the second evening, he left the Terran quarters alone, dressed in civilian clothing, and walked through the public corridors of the orbital station. The station was a city in itself, home to thousands of diplomats, traders, and support staff from dozens of species. Nathan moved through it like any other visitor, stopping at market stalls, sitting in public gathering spaces, watching the flow of alien life around him. He was not sightseeing. He was meeting people. His first contact was a Fenrai trader named Chiswick, a small avian creature with bright green feathers and quick, nervous eyes. The Fenrai were a spacefaring species who had applied for full council membership over 200 years ago. Nathan had learned about them from intelligence reports, but he did not approach Chiswick with intelligence. He approached him with a question. "Why do you think your application has taken so long?" he asked, sitting across from the Fenrai in a quiet corner of a public food court. Chiswick clicked his beak and tilted his head. "You already know why, Captain. Everyone knows why. The Karath control the membership committee. They approve who they want and delay who they do not. We are traitors. We are not useful to them." "Does that make you angry?" "It makes me tired," Chiswick said. "Anger requires hope. We stopped hoping a long time ago." Nathan nodded and asked nothing more. He bought the Fenrai a drink, and they talked about trade routes and weather patterns on Fenrai homeworlds. When they parted, Chiswick looked at him with something close to curiosity. The next evening, Nathan met with a Kelshi delegate, a large amphibious being named Dren, who spoke slowly and carefully, as though each word cost something. The Kelshi homeworld had once been rich in natural resources, but Salhari mining corporations had been granted extraction rights by the Council decades ago. The Kelshi received almost nothing in return. Their oceans were polluted. Their spawning grounds were damaged. They had filed complaints. The complaints vanished into the Council's bureaucracy and were never seen again. Dren told Nathan this without emotion. It was simply fact to him, the way gravity was fact. Something you lived with because you had no choice. Nathan listened. He did not promise anything. He simply listened. And Laura, who accompanied him to this meeting, recorded everything with the delegates' permission. On the fourth day, they met with a Morith observer. The Morith were a quiet, reclusive species who rarely spoke in council sessions. Their representative, whose name translated roughly as still water, told Nathan that the Morith had no complaints because the council had never done anything to them. They had also never done anything for them. The Morith existed on the edges of galactic civilization, neither helped nor harmed, simply forgotten. "We are like furniture," Stillwater said in a voice that sounded like wind moving through dry grass. "Present in the room, never consulted." Nathan met with delegations from 11 more species over the following days. The Vreshi, whose colony world had been reassigned to the Drelith without their consent. The Tannock, who had been denied trade access to 3 major shipping lanes because they had voted against a Solhari proposal 40 years ago. The Pelani, whose ambassador had been quietly removed from a committee after raising questions about the Karath's financial practices. Every story was different in its details. Every story was the same in its shape. The powerful took what they wanted, and the rest stayed quiet, because staying quiet was safer than speaking up. Laura compiled the testimonies into a secure file, and encrypted it with Terran military-grade protocols. She was careful. Pete Novak had reported on the third day that Drelith's security agents were following the Terran delegation. They were not subtle about it. 2 tall, dark-scaled Drelith in unmarked clothing shadowed Nathan and Laura whenever they left their quarters. It was meant to intimidate. "If they are going to follow us," she told Nathan, "they could at least be good at it." Nathan told her to let them watch. Everything he was doing was perfectly legal. He was talking to people. That was all. On the 5th day, Pete discovered that their communications were being monitored. The Drelith had placed listening devices in the corridor outside their quarters, and someone was attempting to crack the Terran encryption on their transmissions. Laura checked the security of their systems and confirmed that the encryption was holding. Terran technology was younger than most species systems, but it had been designed by people who had spent centuries trying to spy on each other. The Drelith were good. Humanity was better at being paranoid. On the 6th day, a small ship dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the Ashara system. It was a Terran courier vessel, compact and unremarkable, the kind of ship that carried mail and routine dispatches between colonies. It was called the Sparrow, and its pilot was a young officer named Lieutenant Amy Sutter. Amy was 26 years old, with short brown hair and a habit of humming to herself during long flights. She had been given her orders directly by Admiral Blake's office, told to fly to Ashara Prime at maximum speed and deliver a sealed data core to Captain Nathan Cole personally. She was told nothing about what the data core contained. She did not ask. The Sparrow docked with the Iron Veil, which was still holding position in orbit, under the watchful eyes of Drelith escort ships. Amy carried the data core in a reinforced case, walked through the corridors of the carrier, and handed it to Nathan in his quarters. He thanked her. She saluted, returned to the Sparrow, and went to the crew mess to find something to eat. Her part, she thought, was done. Nathan locked the door to his quarters and opened the data core. The information inside had been gathered over 3 years by Terran intelligence operatives working deep undercover in trade networks and communications hubs across Council space. It was the kind of work that no one talked about, the kind that happened in back rooms and encrypted channels, the kind that could start a war if it was discovered. He read through it for 2 hours. When he finished, he sat very still for a long time. Laura came to check on him an hour later. She knocked twice, and he opened the door. His face was the same as always, calm and steady. But she had known him for 15 years, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was not fear. It was the look of a man holding a match in a room full of dry wood, deciding whether the fire was worth what it would burn. "Is it what we needed?" she asked. "It is more than what we needed," he said. That evening, Nathan showed the contents of the data core to Ambassador Haynes. They sat in the ambassador's quarters with the door sealed and every security measure active. Nathan laid out the information piece by piece, watching Haynes's face as the picture took shape. When it was done, Haynes leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He was quiet for nearly a full minute. "They will never forgive us for this," he said. "They do not have to forgive us," Nathan replied. "They just have to respect us." Haynes closed his eyes. He thought about the council chamber, the towering banners, the dismissive tone in Zelkon's voice, the small human emblem hidden behind a dead species flag. He thought about the Fenrai and the Kelshi and the Morith and all the others who had been pushed down and kept quiet for centuries. He opened his eyes. "Request an emergency session," he said. "Full council. Tomorrow morning." Nathan nodded and stood. At the door, Haynes called after him. "Nathan, are we sure about this?" Nathan looked back at him. "No," he said, "but I am sure about what happens if we do nothing." The request went out that night. Zelkon, clearly annoyed, granted the session, expecting that the humans had finally come to their senses and were ready to announce their withdrawal. Word spread quickly through the station. By morning, every delegation on Ashara Prime knew that the Terrans had called an emergency meeting. The Grand Atrium filled to capacity. Species that had not attended a session in years sent representatives. Everyone wanted to see the infant species bow. He chose the same dark suit he had worn to the first hearing. He adjusted his collar, checked his notes one final time, and walked out to meet Nathan, Laura, and Pete. The four of them walked together through the corridors toward the Grand Atrium. No one spoke. Their footsteps echoed off the polished floors. Draelith guards watched them pass with flat, unblinking eyes. They entered the chamber. Every seat was filled. Hundreds of alien faces turned to look at them. The silence was enormous. Haynes walked to the speaking platform in the center of the floor. He set his notes down, looked up at the assembled council, and took a single breath. The Galactic Council believed we were bluffing until we shattered their order. Part 4. The Shattering. Daniel Haynes did not begin with an apology. He did not begin with a plea. He began with a story. He told the council about Earth. He spoke about a small blue world where billions of people had spent thousands of years fighting over land, resources, and ideas. He spoke about wars that killed millions, about weapons that could erase cities in a single flash of light, about centuries of cruelty and greed that had pushed his species to the very edge of extinction. He kept his voice calm, almost conversational, the way a man might talk about something painful that happened a long time ago. The chamber was silent. 400 species listened to a human tell them the worst things his people had ever done to each other. Then Haynes paused, looked up at the towering rows of alien delegates, and said, "We almost destroyed ourselves, but we did not. And the reason we did not is because enough of us decided that truth was more important than comfort, and that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of violence. We learned that lesson the hard way. We paid for it with blood that took generations to wash away, and we carried that lesson with us when we came to the stars." He let the words settle. Then he picked up his datapad. "I did not come here today to announce our withdrawal from the Valen Reach," he said. "I came here to show you what we found." The holographic display in the center of the chamber activated. A three-dimensional map of the Valen Reach appeared, rotating slowly, its star systems marked in pale blue light. Haynes began to present the evidence. The data core delivered by Lieutenant Amy Sutter contained intelligence that Terran operatives had spent 3 years gathering. Deep cover agents had been embedded in trade networks, shipping companies, and communications relay stations across Council space. They had intercepted transmissions, copied financial records, and documented movements of goods and ships that were supposed to be secret. Haynes started with the Drylith. He showed the Council that the Drylith hegemony had been secretly mining Valite from the Valan Reach for over 800 years. The mining was conducted through a network of shell corporations registered on neutral worlds, companies that existed only on paper, owned by other companies that existed only on paper, all of them tracing back to accounts controlled by the Drylith military. Haynes displayed the shipping manifests. He showed the routes the ore transports took, disguised as commercial freighters, slipping through quiet corridors of space where no one was watching. He played intercepted audio of Drylith officers discussing production quotas and delivery schedules. The Drylith delegation sat rigid in their elevated seats. Zelkon's scales had shifted from gray to a deep dark color that Nathan recognized from intelligence briefings as a sign of extreme anger or extreme fear. Haynes did not stop. He turned to the Solhari Dominion. The evidence showed that the Solhari had known about the Drylith mining operations for at least 500 years. Rather than report the violation, the Solhari had negotiated a secret profit-sharing agreement. 20% of all Valite extracted from the Reach was funneled to Solhari accounts through the same network of shell corporations. In exchange, the Solhari used their influence on the Council to block any proposals that might lead to inspections of the Reach. They voted down survey missions. They buried requests for transparency. They kept the buffer zone empty so the Drylith could keep mining, and they took their cut. The Solhari representative's luminous skin flickered rapidly, the equivalent of a human turning pale. Several minor species in the chamber began talking among themselves. The noise grew. Haynes raised his voice slightly, not shouting, but firm enough to cut through the murmur. He turned to the Karath Collective. The evidence here was different, but no less damaging. Terran intelligence had uncovered a systematic pattern of vote manipulation spanning centuries. The Karath controlled the Council's administrative apparatus, the committees, the scheduling, the procedural rules. They used this control to reward species that supported their interests and punish those that did not. Economic aid was granted or withheld based on voting patterns. Trade access was opened or closed depending on loyalty. Species that challenged the Karath found their proposals delayed, their representatives excluded from key meetings, and their concerns lost in bureaucratic dead ends. Haynes named specific cases. He described how the Fenri's membership application had been deliberately stalled because the Fenri had supported a trade reform that the Karath opposed. He showed how Kelshi environmental complaints had been routed to a committee that had not held a meeting in 30 years. He documented how the Morith had been systematically excluded from every significant council decision for over a century, simply because they had no resources the Karath wanted. The chamber was no longer silent. Delegations were standing. Holographic displays around the room flickered with incoming transmissions as homeworlds across the galaxy received the news and demanded answers. The noise built like a wave, voices overlapping in a dozen languages, translator struggling to keep up. Zelkon slammed his fist against the podium. The sound rang through the chamber like a gunshot. "Order," he said. His voice was a low growl. "This session will come to order." The noise died down, but not completely. There was an energy in the room now, a tension that had not been there before, like the air before a storm. Zelkon pointed at Haynes. These are fabricated accusations. Terran intelligence is barely 60 years old. You expect this council to believe that your spies uncovered what no one else has found in 9,000 years? Haynes did not flinch. No one else was looking, he said, and the evidence speaks for itself. Every document, every record, every transmission I have shown today is verifiable. Check it yourselves. We welcome the scrutiny. This session is suspended, Zelkon declared. The Terran delegation will be detained, pending an investigation into espionage charges. He signaled to the Draelith guards positioned around the chamber. They moved forward, their heavy footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Nathan Cole stepped forward. He moved calmly, placing himself beside Haynes on the speaking platform, and raised his voice so the entire chamber could hear. "Before you detain us," he said, "you should know that the Terran Compact transmitted the complete evidence package to every species in this council approximately 4 minutes ago. Every delegation in this room now has a copy. So does every independent news network in known space. So does every public archive on every connected world, from here to the Outer Rim." He paused and let that sink in. There is nothing left to suppress. The chamber went very still. Zelkon stared at Nathan with an expression that had moved beyond anger into something harder and colder. The guards stopped moving, uncertain, looking to their commander for direction. Nathan held Zelkon's gaze without blinking. Behind him, Laura received a transmission on her earpiece. She listened for a moment, then spoke quietly to Nathan. He nodded. "One more thing," Nathan said, addressing the full council. A Terran battle group of 36 ships, including 4 heavy cruisers and the fleet carrier Resolute Dawn, entered the Ashara system approximately 10 minutes ago. They have taken up defensive positions around our vessel, the Iron Veil. They are not targeting anyone, they are not making threats. They are simply here to ensure that this delegation is allowed to leave safely when our business is concluded. He let the silence stretch. "We did not come here to start a war," he said. "We came here to tell the truth. What you do with that truth is your decision." The entire grand atrium held its breath. Then a single figure stood in the lower galleries. It was Chiswick, the Fenrai trader Nathan had met days earlier. His green feathers were ruffled with emotion, and his voice was high and clear. "The Fenrai demand an independent investigation into these allegations," he said. "We support the Terran evidence and request that a neutral tribunal be formed immediately." Before Zelkon could respond, another figure stood. Dren, the Kelshi delegate, rose slowly to his full height, water glistening on his broad amphibian shoulders. "The Kelshi stand with the Fenrai," he said. "We have waited decades for someone to speak about what has been done to us. We will not be silent any longer." Then Stillwater, the Morith observer, stood. The Morith representative had not spoken in the council chamber in over 40 years. Every eye turned. "The Morith are present," Stillwater said, in that soft wind-like voice. "We have always been present. Today, for the first time, we choose to be heard." One by one, delegations stood. The Vreshi, the Tanakh, the Pelani, species that had been pushed to the margins for centuries, rose from their seats and added their voices to the call. Within minutes, over 60 species had demanded an independent investigation. The number kept growing. Zelkon looked around the chamber. His scales had turned a color Nathan had never seen before, a pale, washed-out shade that made him look older and smaller than he had seemed just minutes ago. He turned to his Draelith advisors. They sat frozen, their eyes moving across the room, counting the delegations that had stood against them, watching the order they had built over millennia come apart in real time. No one had answers. The system they had maintained through secrecy and control was crumbling, because a species that had been among the stars for barely a generation had done something no one expected. They had told the truth, loudly, publicly, and without asking permission. Pete Novak stood behind Nathan, with his arms at his sides, watching the room with the practiced calm of a man who had been in dangerous situations before. Laura stood beside him, her hand resting lightly near her communicator, ready for anything. Haynes looked at Nathan. There was something in his eyes that might have been relief, or might have been fear, or might have been both. Nathan gave him the smallest nod. It was done. The match had been struck. The fire was burning, and there was no putting it out. The Galactic Council believed we were bluffing until we shattered their order. Part 5. A New Arrangement. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. For 9,000 years, the Galactic Council had operated on the understanding that the powerful stayed powerful and the weak stayed quiet. That understanding died on the floor of the Grand Atrium the day a human ambassador laid out the truth for everyone to hear. And no amount of political maneuvering could bring it back to life. The evidence was everywhere. Within hours of the Terran Compact's broadcast, every news network in known space was running the story. Financial analysts on a dozen worlds began tracing the shell corporations Haynes had identified, and they found exactly what the evidence said they would find. Dralith mining operations in the Valen Reach, hidden behind layers of false registrations and dummy accounts, pumping Valite out of systems that were supposed to be empty. Solhari bank records showing centuries of profit-sharing payments. Karath administrative logs revealing patterns of vote manipulation so systematic that they had become practically invisible, woven into the normal workings of the Council like rot inside a wall. Independent investigators confirmed it all. Every piece of evidence the humans had presented held up under scrutiny. The Dralith tried to claim the records were fabricated. The investigators showed that the mining equipment was still in the Reach, operating on automated schedules that had been running for decades. The Solhari tried to distance themselves from the profit-sharing agreement. The banking records had timestamps and authorization codes that matched their own internal systems. The Karath said nothing at all, which said everything. High Arbiter Zelkon was removed from his position on the 14th day. He did not go quietly. He argued that the Council's stability depended on strong leadership, and that dismantling the existing structure would lead to chaos. Several elder species supported him, worried about what would come next. But the numbers were against him. Over 90 species had now formally demanded reform, and the momentum was impossible to stop. A rotating tribunal was established to replace the High Arbiter's office. Its members were drawn from species outside the traditional inner circle, selected by a process that was, for the first time in the Council's history, genuinely transparent. The Fenrai, the Kelshi, and the Morith were all invited to participate. Chisik, the trader Nathan had shared a drink with on the orbital station, was appointed as the Fenrai's representative. He looked slightly stunned when the announcement was made, as though he had spent so long not hoping that he had forgotten what hope felt like. The Dralith hegemony, the Solhari Dominion, and the Karath Collective retained their seats on the Council. No one seriously proposed expelling them. They were too large, too powerful, and too deeply integrated into the galactic economy to simply remove. But their permanent veto power, a privilege they had held since the Council's founding, was revoked by a vote of 237 to 41. It was the largest margin in any Council vote in recorded history. A new charter was drafted over the following weeks. Ambassador Daniel Haynes was deeply involved in the process, working alongside delegates from dozens of species to build a framework that would prevent the kind of quiet corruption that had defined the old system. The new charter guaranteed equal legal standing for all member species, regardless of their size or the length of their membership. It established independent oversight committees with the authority to investigate any species, including the founding members. It required regular transparency reports from all council bodies, and it declared the Valen Reach open territory, accessible to any species that filed a proper claim and submitted to environmental regulations designed to prevent the kind of exploitation the Drelith had practiced for centuries. The work was long and difficult. There were arguments, compromises, and moments when the whole process nearly collapsed under the weight of competing interests. But it held together, and the reason it held together was that enough species had finally seen what the old system really was and decided they wanted something better. Haynes was offered a seat on the new tribunal. He accepted, but not before having a long conversation with Nathan Cole in the corridor outside the drafting chamber. "Do we have the right to help build this?" Haynes asked. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, looking tired but not defeated. "We tore it down. Some would say we have no business helping rebuild it." Nathan thought about that. Tearing down a rotten structure is only worthwhile if you are willing to help build what comes next, he said. Otherwise, you are just breaking things. That sounds like something a history professor would say. I learned it from one. Haynes smiled for the first time in weeks. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but real. Captain Nathan Cole returned to the Iron Veil with Laura Price and Pete Novak on the 28th day. The ship was ordered home to Earth. The journey back through slipspace was quieter than the journey out. The crew, who had been running on tension and adrenaline for nearly a month, finally let themselves breathe. Laura spent most of the trip reviewing the new intelligence protocols that had been established as part of the Council reforms. She had been promoted to captain and given command of her own vessel, a fast cruiser called the Northwind. She had not expected the promotion and handled the news with her usual combination of competence and mild irritation at having more responsibility. Pete Novak received a commendation for his service during the mission. When the announcement was made over the ship's intercom, he was in the gym. He heard it, nodded once, and went back to his workout. Several crew members later said they thought they saw him almost smile, but no one could confirm it. Nathan himself was promoted quietly upon his return to Earth. Admiral Blake met him personally at the orbital dock and told him he was being given command of a new deep space exploration wing, a fleet of ships tasked with pushing further into uncharted territory than any human vessel had gone before. It was the kind of assignment that most officers spent their entire careers dreaming about. You earned it, Blake said. A lot of people earned it, Nathan replied. Blake studied him for a moment. You know they will not all thank you for what happened out there. The Drelith have long memories. The Solhari are not the forgiving type. I know. Are you worried? Nathan looked out the viewport at Earth, hanging blue and white in the darkness. Impossibly beautiful. I was not raised to be worried, he said. I was raised to do what needed doing. Lieutenant Amy Sutter, the courier pilot who had delivered the data core aboard the Sparrow, was awarded a commendation she had not expected. She attended the small ceremony in her dress uniform, shook the Admiral's hand, and returned to her quarters feeling slightly dazed. That evening, she called an old friend from flight school. I had no idea what was on that data core, she said. They just told me to fly fast and deliver it. Her friend asked if she would have done anything differently if she had known what it contained. Amy was quiet for a moment, thinking. No, she said. I would have flown faster. Admiral Karen Blake held a press conference at Terran Fleet Command 3 days after the delegation's return. The room was packed with journalists from every major network on Earth and the colonies. The questions were sharp and relentless. Was humanity's action reckless? Had they risked a galactic war? Were the intelligence operations legal under Terran law? Blake answered each question directly. She did not dodge or deflect. When a reporter asked whether humanity had been reckless in challenging the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, she paused for a long moment. The risk of doing nothing was greater, she said. If we had backed down, we would have told every species in the galaxy that humanity could be pushed around. We would have told the Drelith that they could mine stolen resources in secret and face no consequences. We would have told every small, forgotten species on that council that no one was coming to help them. That was not a message we were willing to send. She looked directly into the cameras. We did not go to the stars to kneel. The story might have ended there, with speeches and promotions and the satisfaction of a battle well fought. But it did not end there, because the point of what happened was never really about the politicians or the officers or the intelligence operatives. It was about the people they were fighting for. On a small human colony in the Valen Reach, in a settlement called Haven, a girl named Sophie stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where her family lived. She was 10 years old, with tangled hair and dirt on her knees from climbing the rocks near the river. The sun was setting, and the sky above her was turning colors that had no names in any Earth language, deep purples and soft golds that blended together at the horizon like paint mixed by a careless, generous hand. Above her, the stars were coming out. Among them, she could see the faint lights of ships moving through the corridor of space that people on the news had been talking about for weeks. She did not understand most of what the adults said about it. She knew that some very important people far away had tried to make her family leave their home. She knew that her mother had cried when the news came through, and that her father had stood very still for a long time before picking her up and holding her tight. She did not know about high arbiters or Valite or shell corporations. She did not know about data cores or battle groups or charter reforms. She knew that this valley was her home, with its strange purple sunsets and its wide, slow river and the sound of wind moving through the tall grass that grew on the hillsides. She waved at the ships moving overhead, even though she knew they could not see her. It felt like the right thing to do. They were up there, so far away, doing things she could not imagine, and she was down here, standing on a ridge with dirt on her knees, and somehow all of it was connected. A light blinked in the sky, probably just a ship changing course. But Sophie decided it was someone waving back. She grinned, turned, and ran down the hill toward home, her laughter rising behind her and drifting up into the evening air, up past the ridge and the river and the purple sky, up toward the stars that humanity had fought to keep. And somewhere out there, in the vast and ancient dark, the galaxy was listening. The Galactic Council believed we were bluffing until we shattered their order. Part 1. The Summons. The message arrived at 3 a.m, ship time. Captain Nathan Cole was sitting alone in the observation deck of the deep space carrier Iron Veil, drinking cold coffee and watching the stars drift past the viewport, when his communicator beeped twice. That was the signal for a priority transmission from Earth. He set the coffee down, pulled up the holographic display on his wrist, and read the orders in silence. He read them again. Then he stood up and went to wake his first officer. Lieutenant Commander Laura Price was not a person who enjoyed being woken up early. She answered the door to her quarters, with her hair pulled back, and her eyes narrowed in a way that made most junior officers take a step backward. Nathan had known her for 15 years. He did not step backward. "We have new orders," he said. "It is 3 a.m, she replied. "The Galactic Council has summoned us. Earth wants us to escort a diplomatic envoy to Ashara Prime. We leave in 12 hours. Laura stared at him for a long moment. Then she sighed, pulled on her boots, and followed him to the bridge. Humanity had been traveling among the stars for 62 years. In that time, they had built colonies on 7 worlds, established trade with a handful of alien species, and earned a provisional membership in the Galactic Council, which was the governing body of over 400 civilizations. The Council had maintained order in the galaxy for nearly 9,000 years, and its founding species treated younger races the way an old man might treat a child who wandered into a business meeting. They did not listen. The trouble had started 6 months ago, when 3 human colony ships settled in a region of space called the Valen Reach. The Reach was a long corridor of star systems between the territories of 2 powerful species, the Dralith Hegemony and the Salhari Dominion. 3,000 years ago, the two had agreed to keep the Reach empty as a buffer zone. Humanity had filed the proper paperwork for expansion into the area. No one had responded. So the colonists went ahead. Now the council wanted them out. Ambassador Daniel Haynes arrived aboard the Iron Veil the following morning, carried by a shuttle from the diplomatic station orbiting Mars. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with a calm face and careful hands. Before he became a diplomat, he had been a history professor at a university in Virginia. And he still had the habit of speaking, as though every sentence was part of a lecture. He shook Nathan's hand firmly and said he was confident they could resolve this matter through proper channels. Nathan nodded and said nothing. He had heard that kind of confidence before, usually from people who had never dealt with the council's inner circle. Laura met Haynes in the briefing room and laid out everything they knew. The council's enforcement arm, called the Arbiters, had issued a formal warning demanding that humanity withdraw from the Valen Reach immediately. 3 species on the council's inner circle, the Dralith, the Solhari, and a third called the Karath Collective, had made public statements calling humanity a reckless and dangerous species that needed to be brought under control. The language was not diplomatic. It was a threat dressed in polite words. Haynes listened carefully and asked intelligent questions. Laura found herself liking him despite her instinct to distrust politicians. Before they departed, Nathan pulled Laura aside in the corridor outside the bridge. He kept his voice low. "Run combat drills," he said. She looked at him. "This is a diplomatic mission." "Run them anyway. Full readiness. I want every weapon system checked and every crew member sharp." "The ambassador will not like it." "The ambassador does not need to know." Laura studied his face. She had served with Nathan through 2 border skirmishes and 1 full engagement against pirates in the outer colonies. She knew what he looked like when he was worried. This was not worry. This was something quieter and more deliberate. She nodded and walked away. The Iron Veil entered slipspace that afternoon. The journey to Ashara Prime would take 9 days. During that time, the crew fell into a rhythm. The diplomats prepared their arguments. Nathan spent hours reviewing intelligence reports in his quarters, cross-referencing data from Terran scouts who had been watching the Valen Reach for months. On the 4th day, Laura brought him something that changed the shape of everything. She had intercepted fragmented communications from Dralith military channels. The encryption was heavy, but Terran codebreakers had managed to pull out enough to paint a picture. The Dralith were moving warships into the Valen Reach. Not a few patrol vessels, dozens of capital ships, heavy cruisers with enough firepower to glass a planet. "This is not a border dispute," Laura said, dropping the data onto his desk. "This is a build-up for something bigger." Nathan stared at the numbers on his screen. 43 confirmed Dralith warships in a region that was supposed to be empty. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. That evening, he invited Haynes to his quarters and showed him the intelligence. The ambassador sat in the chair across from Nathan's desk and read through the data without speaking. When he finished, he set the tablet down and rubbed his eyes. "They are not just trying to push us out of the Reach," Haynes said quietly. "They want something there." "Yes," Nathan said. "Do we know what?" "Not yet. But whatever it is worth deploying the fleet to protect." Haynes was quiet for a long time. Then he straightened his back and folded his hands. "The Council respects protocol above everything else," he said. "Their entire system is built on rules and procedures. If we can show that we followed the rules and they did not, we win. And if they do not care about rules, then we will need something else." Nathan held his gaze. I have already made a request to Admiral Blake back on Earth. She is working on it. Haynes did not ask what the request was. Perhaps he did not want to know yet. On the 9th day, the Iron Veil dropped out of slipspace above Ashara Prime. The planet filled the viewport like a jewel, wrapped in silver rings of orbital stations that caught the light of its pale sun. Thousands of ships moved through the space around it, a constant flow of traffic from every corner of the galaxy. It was the most heavily populated world in known space, and it was beautiful in the way that powerful things are beautiful, impressive and cold at the same time. A transmission came through within seconds of their arrival. The voice was flat, mechanical, and carried the tone of something that had repeated the same words 1,000 times. Terran vessel, you will power down all weapon systems and submit to escort. Non-compliance will be interpreted as hostility. Nathan looked at Laura. She raised an eyebrow and shook her head slowly. He opened the channel, keeping his voice as calm and even as still water. We comply, he said, for now. Laura leaned close enough that only he could hear. For now is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Nathan almost smiled. Almost. The escort ships closed in around them, sleek Dreylift cruisers with hulls the color of dark iron, and guided the Iron Veil toward the orbital station where the council held its sessions. As they drifted closer, Nathan stood at the viewport and watched the alien city grow larger and larger until it filled his entire field of vision. Somewhere down there, the most powerful beings in the galaxy were waiting for humanity to walk in and bow. They expected fear. They expected submission. They expected the infant species to know its place. Nathan Cole finished his cold coffee and set the cup down on the console. They were going to be very disappointed.